This is the third talk in a series designed to join up the arts and the sciences. It was first given on the 18th of April 2007 and is being given today, Wednesday the 16th of December 2015. The never-ending, unbridled male dream of the great Southern Queen. Part 1. The literary theme of the visit to, or visit by, the great Southern Queen. In 1482 BC, in the 8th year of her reign, Queen Hatshepsut sent a major expedition, 5 huge ships, south, down the Red Sea to one of a number of lands that, from about the 1550s on, were under some sort of Egyptian control. The land was the land of Punt, probably modern-day Somalia. When the expedition arrived, fair and free trade was conducted with the Puntians, probably at the end of Egyptian spears. Then the Egyptians loaded up their booty, took it back to Egypt, completing a mission that lasted 3 years. Presented the goods to Queen Hatshepsut, and she in turn presented them to the god Amun. The remarkable commemoration of this expedition is to be found on Queen Hatshepsut's funerary monument at Deir al-Bahri. But did it, I hear you silently ask, really happen? There are grounds for suspicion. First, from a general point of view, what pharaohs claim to have done in their advertising campaigns on their monuments often turns out to be a massive distortion of historical reality. One detail of the story is a clue to a lack of historicity. The 3-year time frame for the expedition. 3 years is a conventional length of time for a long expedition in the early ancient world. The expedition of Phoenician convicts that Pharaoh Necho, 609 to 594, forced to go south, and which ended up circumnavigating Africa, took 3 years. Herodotus 441. Solomon's ships, which travelled to Tarshish, probably modern Spain, but possibly the Indus Valley, and back, took 3 years. 1 Kings 10:22. So, conventional detail, which suggests conventional storytelling, which suggests non-history. So what are we looking at with this monument? I think the true significance of this alleged expedition is to be found on the 2 panels which deal with who presented what to whom. In the bottom panel, on the right, we have the Egyptians, the envoy in front of an armed escort. They are presenting their goods, which are all clearly displayed. They are manufactured items, torques, bangles, weapons, and bead chains. On the left, the Puntians raise their hands and say, "You and your goods are great and wonderful." In the top panel, the Puntians are bringing in their goods to the envoy, now unattended. The large ellipse might be an empty table awaiting the actual depositing of the goods. What I think should be called the ideological interpretation of these 2 panels is that we, the Egyptian imperialists viewing the funerary monument, are giving the Puntians not only those magnificent goods, but also the security that comes with our efficient military. Reading that what is moving in from the right is what we are giving. And the Puntians are, of course, deliriously happy with this imperial hegemony. But what do we get from them in return? Well, in the top panel there is a minimizing of their contribution. First of all, there is the empty table to indicate perhaps that the Puntians make you wait. But secondly, the Puntians are not carrying what we know the Egyptians are interested in: gold, ivory, wood, the resins of special woods, i.e. the frankincense and myrrh for perfume and for medicinal purposes. Slaves and exotica, such as monkeys and coloured birds, some of which we see being hauled on board the boats in other panels on the monument, which go up this way. Instead, the Puntians bring what? The king, one fish. The queen brings nothing. The next man brings the covered trencher. Then comes the 2 bags or trays of whatever they are. And then comes the domesticated animal. So there is a depreciation of the Puntian contribution to the, quotes, trade deal. What they are bringing is a bit unclear and a bit basic. So that is the straight ideological interpretation, but I think we should go beyond that to what I'm going to call the hyper-ideological interpretation. What Pharaoh depicts on his monument, and which will inevitably be interpreted by modern minds as historical occurrence, is in fact rather a much bigger statement. It's more like, this is the way the world is, now and forevermore. And this is the way civilization works. And the way civilization works is that we imperialists provide high-order manufactures and well-trained, well-armed military forces, and our imperial satellites provide the primary produce, the raw materials, and the basics for life. With this context in mind, we can now turn specifically, at last, to our great southern queen, the Queen of Punt. If this lady were to appear in a modern-day doctor's surgery, the doctor would be diagnosing, but not out loud, what is popularly and jocularly known as duck's disease. Out loud, the doctor would be talking about a probable celiac condition or achondroplasia, abnormal bone growth that results in short stature with disproportionately short arms and legs, or Madelung's disease, an impaired ability to make certain digestive enzymes normally secreted by the pancreas. But I don't think that is what the artist is telling us with his portrait. What the artist is telling us with his portrait is made very clear by giving her a see-through dress. This is because a see-through dress enables us to observe her fabulous upper thighs, and in particular, her rugby league front rowers, vasti mediales. Yes, plural, understanding that vastus medialis on her right leg has been duplicated in an anatomical impossibility on her left leg, which looks almost like pendulous breasts or ripe fruit. The full ripe fruit idea seems especially warranted by the parade of Puntian gifts, which to me looks like a dinner parade. The king has a fish. The covered trencher probably contains a dinner item. Then there are possibly sacks of grain or flour, and then the domesticated animal. The trouble is, I can't think of a single example of a potentate wanting to appear in this way, that is, to be depicted in a line of food, and certainly not to be depicted as food. So I'm going to suggest, completely in accord with our wider ideological interpretations, that this depiction of the Queen of Punt is an exclusively northern, here of course Egyptian perception of a southern phenomenon, and further suggest that the perception is a male's perception. The Queen of Punt is a sort of boy's own fantasy. You can pack down in a rugby league scrum with her, you can sire children on her, and you can be fed all the while. What our northern male sees when he turns his gaze to this southern queen is a dreamlike confection. He doesn't see any actual historical personage, some actual Queen of Punt. He sees rather an emblematic package, a package which contains power, wealth, childbearing hips, callipygy, i.e. spectacular thighs, and an endless procession of food. I'm going to refer to this phenomenon in this talk as the fecundity package. So we are asserting that the fecundity package, when properly ordered, is what civilization fundamentally means for our northern male viewer. But why have we begun this talk by dwelling at length on one innocent image from Egyptian antiquity? Because it's a rather stark illustration of a motif. The image of the Queen of Punt on the Hatshepsut monument and the idea of her being a fecundity and high civilization package, and of her having a dreaming northern male viewer, whilst quite possibly appearing like some sort of artistic oddity, is not at all to readers of classical and not so classical antiquity, where the motif of the remarkable southern female potentate and her northern male admirer keeps turning up all the time. For this talk, I've made a list of these, and I'd like to quickly run through the list, first of all, so that we can remind ourselves of some of these queens and their fictive contexts, but secondly, to see if the idea of their southernness can be maintained. The south, I should mention, by way of clarification, is going to be anywhere to the south of Greco-Roman writers, the principal writers of classical antiquity. Number 1, Dido. She is the queen who Aeneas finds refuge with after his flight from Troy in the Aeneid. She's the queen of Carthage, so southern Mediterranean, tick. Nausicaa and Arete, they are impressive royal females, daughter and mother, that Odysseus, again it's the taking refuge idea, takes refuge with in the Odyssey in the land of Phaeacia. Large amounts have been written on where the seaside paradise of Phaeacia is to be found. I'm going to merely suggest that any mystery destination for the Greeks is likely to be somewhere to the south, since they are likely to have actual knowledge of any northern Mediterranean locales. The Queen of Sheba, she is the queen in the Old Testament who visits King Solomon because she wants to know true wisdom. She is also an apocalyptic figure in the New Testament. She is the one who will, very notably, turn up at the Last Judgment to both judge and bear witness to the evil generations of men. Sheba is probably to be equated with Saba, which is to say the Sabaean kingdom of southwest Arabia. Its florescence was 900 to 200 BC. Queen Candace from the Alexander romance. She is the queen of Ethiopia who outwits that emblem of Greek male kind, the greatest, the smartest, the most lethal of them all, Alexander the Great. This is achieved by having a portrait done of Alexander before he arrives at her court. When he turns up pretending to be someone else, she tells him she knows who he really is and that he is completely in her power. Notice the art and high civilization associations for her matching it with the great Alexander. She overcomes him with a painting. And is she a queen of the south? The text says she was a queen of Egypt who became queen of Ethiopia. But just for the record, there is no Queen Candace ruling Egypt in the 4th century BC in my Hallow and Simpson ancient history book. But yes, a southern queen. And the Queen Candace in Acts, this Queen Candace is a queen of Ethiopia living in the time of the New Testament apostles. Her eunuch, a minister in charge of all her treasure, is met by the apostle Philip as the eunuch is going by road away from Jerusalem. The eunuch is doing a bit of light reading of the book of Isaiah and asks Philip for some literary critical help with the text. The queen, through her eunuch, is being set up as a symbol of wealth, civilization, and learning. At this point, we must take a brief moment to mention something in connection with the significance of the name Candace. The designation Queen Candace is a Greek mistake, or better still, a mistake, with regard to a potentate's identity. Candace is not a personal name. The Nubian, KDI-GO, has made its way into Greek as Kandake. This is often transliterated, Kandaki, and in English this can be Candace, a fairly common woman's name. Kandake is in fact a title or role in society. She is the great woman. She may be a regnal queen, but not necessarily. In fact, she may be someone that we would be happier to call the Queen Mother. Back to our list, Isis. The Egyptian goddess Isis makes a salvational visit to Corinth in Apuleius' The Golden Ass, which results in the emancipation of the male quasi-hero, who has become trapped in the body of an ass. So, from Egypt, yes, southern. Cleopatra VII of Egypt is the southern queen who has a mesmerizing effect on the whole Greco-Roman world, and particularly and famously on Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The Queen of Punt we've looked at. Punt is way down south, even for Egyptians. Chariclea is the heroine and Meroitic queen in Heliodorus' The Ethiopic Tale. Meroe should probably be located in modern-day Sudan. Cassiopeia and Andromeda, another mother and daughter duo, feature in the Perseus myth. They are Ethiopian queens. So there you have it. The southern queens do, in fact, come from the south, but there's a problem. In ancient literature, and especially in literature for Greeks of an early period, the fictive great queen is often an Eastern one. Look at this list. Whilst this is a list of queens with connections to what we've been talking about, especially high civilization, these queens have a different characterization. They are dangerous, troublemaking queens. You are a good chance to end up having a knife stuck in you by one of these queens or by one of their minders. A particularly interesting and notable case in this list of hostile Eastern queens is Omphale, a queen who is in the unthinkable situation of having a Greek hero, Hercules, as her slave. In short, these queens of the East are not so much part of a never-ending male dream as of a never-ending male nightmare. Nevertheless, there is a certain amount of geographic commonality between the southern and eastern queens. Helen of Troy is not only an eastern queen, there is another tradition of her having never been at Troy, but rather having spent the entire period of the Trojan War harmlessly and innocently in the south, in Egypt. This tradition is treated by Euripides in his Helen. And Dido is the queen of Carthage, but she started life as an eastern or southeastern princess in Tyre. The Queen of Sheba has connections with the east by virtue of her sojourn in Jerusalem. And the Queen Candace of the New Testament likewise is shown to have an abiding connection to Jerusalem, and therefore to the east. So, whilst there is a difference in characterization between the southern and eastern queens, they can still stand as a homogeneous group, representing sex possibility, high civilization, and the fecundity and wealth that goes with it. And the question is, why is it so? Why don't we have interesting fictional queens in, say, Romania or Germany? For our answer, we're going to go way back in time. And let me draw your attention to a map of the Fertile Crescent. The first thing to say is that there is a problem with this map. I have taken this from the internet, and the question arises as to where the person who posted it got it from and what they thought they were presenting. The Fertile Crescent is a term from paleontology to describe that area where animals and grasses were domesticated 14,000 to 10,000 years ago, i.e. 12,000 to 8,000 BC. The animals that were domesticated were pigs, sheep, cows and goats, and the grasses were the ones that became wheat and barley. The area is an area that stretches from modern-day southern Israel, goes up north to Turkey, and then southeast to Mesopotamia. Egypt is not involved. And there's a good reason for this. The Nile was only forming about 12,000 years ago, or 10,000 BC, and people only start nomadic wandering into the Nile Valley about 8,000 years ago, at the very earliest, and more like 7,000 years ago, i.e. 5,000 BC. So the person who has posted this map on the net either doesn't know this or has taken this map from a very old book on prehistory, a book at least 50 years old. The other possibility, the one we charitably prefer to believe, is that the internet poster is creating what we might call a helpful fiction with regard to the Fertile Crescent. Because what happens in Egypt after the nomads move in is quite remarkable. Egyptian civilization forms and catches up to developments in particular, Mesopotamia. So that the historical period in Egypt only starts a mere 100 or 200 years behind the Mesopotamians in the late, very late 4th millennium, say about 3100 BC. So with this helpfully doctored view of the Fertile Crescent, we can see that significant developments in the cultivation of food formed a basis for the emergence of what would later become high-level civilizations. Civilizations with big urban populations, good food supplies, monumental buildings, and elaborate water control systems, and all to the southeast of the Greeks and Romans. I think that here we have a beginning for an explanation of the phenomenon of the fecundity package, great southern queens, and their being objects of admiration and desire in Greco-Roman minds. Part 2, the Phoenix story. Why, in a talk about southern queens, nourishment and bees, are we taking time off to look at the Phoenix story? Firstly, because I suggest that the Phoenix story is curiously another, but an especially interesting version of the Great Southern Queen story. And secondly, because it is going to help us take a close look at a land that seems to play an epicentral role in the phenomenon of southern queens, the land of Egypt. The Phoenix story is one of an exotic and literally unique bird which flies into Egypt every 500 years from the south, and in some versions from the east, i.e. Arabia. When it reaches the temple of the sun at Heliopolis, it dies, is offered to the sun god in a sacrifice, and during the burning of the sacrifice, it mysteriously regenerates. There are other versions. My suggestion here is that the story is an allegory of Egyptian civilization. This is because Bronze Age Egypt regenerated itself every 500 years or so into being a kingdom. Nama, in the pre-dynastic period, gained control in the south, and from there conquered the north. And there are invasions by the south of the north that usher in both the Middle and New Kingdoms, 2686 and 2040. The fourth one, 1558, is the dislodging of the northern invaders, the Hyksos. To give a sense of how this allegory came to life, a little bit of cultural background is needed. In Egypt, for vast periods of its early history, the Egyptians don't have a word for king. The term pharaoh only appears very late. The king is known only by a purely natural designation, the one of the sedge plant, the one of the bee. Why is this so? Because for the Egyptians, the king is a purely natural phenomenon, but also he is a purely theological phenomenon, i.e. a god. This to us would be a paradox. We draw a distinction between natural and supernatural. But the Egyptians don't see the distinction. The gods are the powers in nature and can be dogs, birds, cats, etc. An enduring identification for the king is the Horus bird, i.e. a falcon. If in art the bird is depicted above a city wall or a temple structure design, it indicates that the king claims to be dwelling in or to own that city or temple, with dwelling in and owning from an imperialist point of view being the same thing. This way of natural thinking is going to give rise to a way of speaking where one's whole political vocabulary is itself completely natural. If you want to say that the South has invaded the North, you say, "The great bird has roared in from the South and has descended on the carcass of the North." Enter the Phoenix story. With the Phoenix story, however, the natural metaphor has been augmented by the detail that no one had ever seen the phoenix eat anything, which prompted the supernatural surmise that the bird fed from its own flesh and was therefore completely self-sufficient. Add the natural metaphor to the supernatural surmise, and you have the allegory of the dynasty that is capable of regenerating itself over and over, dying but then coming to life with the same genetic makeup. In short, the Phoenix story is a parallel story to that of the Great Southern Queen, with the Phoenix emblem another fecundity civilization package. The great exotic entity from the south appears in the north, bringing civilization, bringing its own food supply, and bringing the power of self-sufficiency. The afterlife of the Phoenix story is instructive. The story enjoys renewed interest with the arrival of the Renaissance in Europe. The revival of antiquity in the 16th century meant that associating yourself with ideas from the distant past put you amongst a certain enlightened elite, and the right particular antique idea could function as a cachet. So it was that in the 1530s, a dispute arose between two Italian publishing houses about who had the right to use the Phoenix impressa, or emblem, on their books. Thereafter, the Phoenix emblem is used by the very powerful Mary of Guise, Elizabeth I, and at the very end of the 16th century, Pope Clement VIII. The point to be noted from this is that the 16th century didn't require 21st century students of biology and literature to alert them to the dynastic implications of the Phoenix story. They worked it out all for themselves. Part 3, biology. As we move into part 3 of this paper on biology, let's give ourselves a little break and allow our minds to go on a holiday to a distant imaginary planet. We'll call it Planet X. Planet X, as you can see, has some similarity to our own planet. It's round. It has a warm zone going through the middle, faintly resembling our tropics, and has cooler areas on both sides. Because the terrain in the two cool zones is not especially fertile, the animals that live there find themselves at something of a distance from their food sources. As a result of this, they have to move around to get to their vegetable protein or their prey. They have to be out and about. and pretty much for their entire lives. Exposed to the cold conditions, exposed to predators, and with a relative lack of food, they have hard lives. In the warm zone, on the other hand, life is quite different. When there is a reasonable amount of rain, the warm zone is extremely fertile. The animals there find themselves close to their food sources and, interestingly, in certain cases, live inside a food source. This leads to a situation where, on the whole, these animals can obtain food more easily and enjoy better security, and this results in longer and easier lives. The climate and nourishment conditions on X have another effect on the animals, and this concerns their social relations. Here I'm going to employ two terms that are the same for planet X biology as for biology here on Earth. The animals in the cool zones are usually called subsocial. This is not a derogatory term, it is rather simply describing the fact that the parents or parent are, so to say, socializing downwards. They look after and feed their own offspring. In the warm zone, the animals are described as eusocial. Close to and even inside their own food sources, life and especially breeding in the warm zone is something of a raging success. A large number of broods in a parental lifetime is the norm, and bothering to actively feed successive broods is not. They are capable of feeding each other, usually after the third brood. In fact, to make a comparison with the cool climate animals, there is a bias towards feeding upwards. In other words, having younger and well-established animals, less well-established animals, feeding older ones. In the warm zone, another feature is very prominent: the diminished need for heavy-duty males, and a corresponding diminished significance for their gender. And corresponding to that, there is an increased focus on the female, especially as progenitor. In fact, the focus on a single female progenitor can become so great that, in some cases, all other generative activity is suppressed. A single case of the evolutionary path of one of the warm zone animals might be instructive. Historians on X say that 300 million years ago, the planet's climate was more mixed, not especially cool or warm in any area. At that time, there existed an animal called the cockroach, quite similar to our cockroach. When the tropical zones started to emerge, so did trees, and in areas of high rainfall, the trees became numerous and big. When in the course of time the trees started to die, the cockroach, a determined eater of their decaying wood, was presented with an eventual multi-million year food resource. The cockroaches took up residence inside the decaying trees and over a long period evolved into termutes, a bit like our termites. The cockroach forthwith underwent a complete metamorphosis in size and shape from sizable and hard-shelled to small and soft, and in its social arrangements switched from subsocial to eusocial. The climatic and biological systems of the imaginary planet X may help us to understand certain issues on our own planet, including our target phenomenon, the Great Southern Queen. And I'd like to begin this section on earthly biology by pursuing just one theoretical detail touched on in the Planet X outline. And that is eusociality. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of what such a feel-good sounding term is doing in science at all. To do this, we are going to have to give a thumbnail sketch of a line of thinking in natural science. Back at the dawn of scientific thinking, the first philosopher Thales posed the question, what is fundamental in nature? And gave the answer, water. Other ancient philosophers made their own suggestions. One of them was fire. And Democritus, somewhat intriguingly, came up with atoms as being the basis of all matter. Scroll down the years to 1655 and Robert Hooke, looking through a primitive telescope at a dried section of cork tree wood, who saw something that he described as a cell. He called it a cell because he thought there was nothing in it. Within a decade, it was known for certain that it contained a liquid substance, but the misnomer stuck. The discovery, however, didn't generate any further interest until more than a century and a half later. In the 1830s, in Germany, Schleiden and Schwann, botanist and physiologist respectively, declared that these cell entities could be found everywhere. The findings of Schleiden and Schwann were taken over and formalized some 20 years later in 1858 by Rudolf Virchow. And his four-part theorem we're going to set forth. 1. The cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. All organisms are composed of cells. 2. All cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. Each cell contains genetic material that is passed down during the process. 3. All basic chemical and physiological functions, for example, repair, growth, movement, immunity, communication, and digestion, are carried on inside of cells. 4. The activities of cells depend on the activities of subcellular structures within the cell. These include organelles, the plasma membrane, and, if present, the nucleus. This four-part theorem leads to two very important generalities about cells and life. 1. Cells are alive. The individual cells of your organs are just as alive as you are, even though they cannot live independently. 2. Most of the activities of a cell, repair, reproduction, etc., are carried out via the production of proteins. Proteins are large molecules that are made by specific organelles within the cell using the instructions contained within the genetic material of the cell. Virchow added to this theory, by way of clarification, this line: the so-called individual should be likened to the social arrangement of a society. The moment he made this statement, the idea of the superorganism was born, although that term wasn't to be used till decades later. At exactly the same time as Virchow's pronouncements, Charles Darwin was revealing to the world that we humans are, in fact, animals, or was understood to be revealing that we humans are animals. Certain people, taking on board Darwin's thesis, started to wonder, not terribly surprisingly, well, if we're animals, what sort of animal are we? And one of the answers from the late 19th century world of armchair philosophy was, almost certainly with Virchow's work in mind, that we are a cooperative animal. Some of these thinkers were quite notable: Peter Kropotkin with his theory of mutual aid, and Morris Maeterlinck, playwright and beekeeper, with his mystical idea of the spirit of the hive. But all this remained armchair philosophy until 1916, when William Morton Wheeler, a studier of ants, coined the term superorganism. From there and throughout the 1920s, the concept aroused serious interest, but was again soon dropped. Apparently, in the lead up to world wars, the idea that we are a highly cooperative species can't gain traction. After World War II, however, the whole scientific world is moving in a new direction. The centre of attention is now firmly on genes and theories about kinship, and remains so for 40 years. In fact, despite some dissenting voices, this genes are the answer view continues right up to the time of the euphoria of the charting of the human genome, and US President Clinton's announcement in 2000 that the charting had been achieved. Meanwhile, in the 1960s and 70s, and even the 80s, the idea of the superorganism is thought to be somewhere between an unfortunate delusion and an outright biological error. In recent times, there has, however, been yet another shift. Gene theory is being overtaken by an understanding that nourishment is the real evolutionary driver. It is known for certain, for instance, that a lack of nutrition can switch off a gene completely. For more on this topic, see epigenetics. Genes, in any case, could never be the full answer to why anything is as it is, because, simple example, if you have a gene that is promoting the activity and directing the hormone release in organ A, and another promoting the activity and directing the hormone release in organ B, there is going to be an interaction between the two directives. The whole genetic functioning of an organism must be a sort of symphony of competing directives. And something else must be wielding the baton. From the recent work on one of the most evolutionarily successful orders on the planet, insects, you would have to say that the something else was the qualities of and the specific properties in nutrition. So now let's turn our attention from theories to actual animals. In particular, let's state which animals have what I'm calling a queen structure. In other words, which animals have societies where a queen is centrally located and socially prominent. A short list would be ants, wasps, bees, termites, and the naked mole rat. Add to them another category of animal species, ones where, for instance, a troop is being led or directed by a single preeminent female. In this category are elephants, lemurs, and meerkats. Out of these, we're going to look at bees. Bees are a good species for this analysis because they are much studied, but also because they appear in nature in the whole range from solitary or subsocial through to semisocial, then to eusocial. In other words, you see the phenomenon in all its degrees, unlike, for instance, ants, all types of which have a queen structure. A rather interesting further point is that only a few of the bee species are eusocial, so that eusociality can be thought of as special. For instance, in Australia, there are 2,000 types of native bee. Of these, only 10 are eusocial. Do the 10 have anything in common? Yes. They are all found way up north. They are all tropical. And this is just as it should be according to the Planet X theoretic. But the extremely interesting complication is the famously eusocial honeybee. In 1822, the honeybee was introduced into Australia for the needs of the emerging settlements. As expected, it thrived all over the country. Does the honeybee then upset the notion of that eusociality is exclusively a feature of the tropics? No. The view is that bees and flowering plants co-evolved 140 to 100 million years ago. Back then, the northern hemisphere was warmer, so the honeybee was eusocial right from the earliest moment in bee evolution, but then succeeded through its masterful thermoregulation to adapt to the colder conditions of later times and the present. And it is the queen-structured society of specifically the honeybee that we're going to look at briefly to show how a superorganism can work. We start with the very first issue of sociality, which is caste or polyethism, different characteredness. For a species to qualify as social in any way, different members of the species have to do different things for the mutual benefit of the group, i.e. different individuals have to do different jobs. The first breakdown of jobs is determined by reproductive function. A breakdown into three categories: queen, female workers, and drones. But a second breakdown pertains exclusively to the female workers. For these latter, there are upwards of 36 discrete functions. Here's a rundown of some of these inside the nest. A retinue of queen's messengers, workers who go with the queen to eliminate rival queens, bees that clean comb cells, and ones that clean individual bees, bees that remove waste, mold, pathogens, debris, and dead bees, bees that concentrate nectar and cap honey, receiver or house bees, which act as, so to say, a bureaucracy who receive nectar brought from outside and, if appropriate, take this nectar to the periphery of the brood area, fanners of air, all manner of trophylactic carriers of food and water, food storers, guards, and bees that feed and attend to the guards, and foragers that having come inside wait in queues to deliver their nectar, or who perform dances to say where they have been foraging. Outside the nest, there are other female workers, more air fanners, foragers, usually specializing in a single flower, propolis collectors, bees that collect plants, resins, saps, and gums that have antifungal and antibacterial properties, scout bees that patrol an area 1 or 2 meters from the entrance, checking for interlopers and predators, and finally, long-distance scouts who are specifically checking the outside world for new accommodation in the event of forced abandonment or in the event of the rather more frequent and often smaller scale move to be nearer better food sources. One of the great goals of the elaborate cooperative system of polyethism, food processing, and trophallaxis is temperature regulation and the maintaining of a constant 35-degree heat at the center of the cluster where the brood is incubating. And we might tackle the issue of temperature by outlining how the hive copes with surviving a European winter. The hive in winter has between 10 to 20,000 bees, about 25,000 to 40,000 in summer. The low numbers in winter present a problem, and it's thought that any colony below 16,000 bees will not survive a severe winter. The honeybee, however, succeeds through a number of measures. 1, the technique of clustering with the head and thorax inside. 2, shivering to keep the metabolic rate going higher as the temperature decreases. And 3, the utilization of the insulation and protective capacity of the panels of the comb. A healthy colony employing all 3 methods, and as mentioned, numbering more than 16,000, can survive a freezing winter. And as well as the cold of winter, the honeybee is able to survive in temperatures up to 70 degrees centigrade in summer, provided it has a water source close by. So they have different jobs and they're able to regulate the temperature. But how does the superorganism actually work? The way to give a short answer here is to address the question, is the queen in charge? She is certainly able to exert a great deal of control. This is through pheromones, through a combination of actively blasting them into the air, smearing them on her own body, and semi-intentionally smearing them on the comb in her travels around the nest. She is able to suppress egg production in her fellow sister bees. This pheromonic dispersal is the real key to the power she has over her fellow sister bees. But she's in control in another way, a way that has the longer term or immortality in mind. She is determining which comb cells are fertilized and which are not. Generally, she leaves a small percentage of the larger cells unfertilized. These will become males and will carry 100% of her DNA. The fertilized eggs will be both male and female, but for the most part, her sister worker bees will snuff out these particular males, the so-called diploid males, and they will be eaten. So it is that the queen has both local and long-term control. The sister worker bees, however, also wield great power in the nest. There is a retinue of roughly 12 bees that attend on and feed the queen. They are able to move through the bee population accompanied by her pheromonic glow, a sort of emblem of sovereignty, influencing the carrying out of tasks and the decisions being made in the hive. There are also many other decision-making bees. It would be a good idea to mention here, by way of the barest minimum, the house or receiver bees. These bees are receiving information from the 10 to 30% of the population who are out foraging on any day with reasonable weather. The house bees are making decisions about the nutritional status of affairs both in and outside of the nest. The computations made at first locally about food standard and food availability and the overall success of the brood rearing will result in the very major and eventually more general decisions to buzz a queen, i.e. fly across the queen, buzzing their wings and disrupting her, forcing her to stop laying, and forcing her to leave a nest that has become either unhygienic or dysfunctional for some other reason, or to move to a new nest that is better located for flowers and nectar. The buzzing flyover is effectively the point of initiation for the famous swarming exodus. These house bees and other generally more experienced bees will also be responsible for the decision to buzz an unmated queen in an ipso facto non-queen right colony, getting her to leave the nest and participate in the reproductive swarm. So much for the sister bees. But please note, in this account of how the superorganism functions, we are leaving out any mention of the honeybees' prodigious feats of memory. For instance, remembering their tasks right through winter. Their prodigious abilities for signalling and interpreting signals. The prodigious feats of architecture, especially the mathematically perfect hexagonal combs. And the capacity for nest hygiene maintenance. 35,000 bees and not one drop of excrement. So far we've sketched how things work in the colony from a rather functional point of view. Now let's look at dynamics, and in particular the question of colonial fitness. The fitness of the whole enterprise of the colony can be traced to the smooth functioning of the polyethical system. How does this arise? Far out from the nest, drones gather from all around. A queen on her nuptial flight encounters them. They pursue her, and about 8 to 12 of them successfully inseminate her by stabbing her with a little sack of sperm. They die, an important part of the story, but their sperm becomes all mixed up in the queen's spermatheca. Later, the queen comes to standing astride the comb cell and to the depositing of her egg. When she adds in the male contribution from the spermatheca, it is a lottery as to which particular genetic component is being added. So it is that a mixture of types is maintained in the colony. Good at foraging, good at feeding, good at cleaning, good at architecture, good at guarding, even, I think we should put it this way, good at mathematical calculation and risk assessment. The fitness of this social arrangement of limited polyandry has an outstanding benefit. It allows a persistent but deliberately low level of kin recognition. A certain amount of kin recognition is required in the colony, especially by the guards and hive entrance scouts who have to act against intruders. But the lowness of kin recognition allows for the complex, non-volatile system to come into existence in the first place. It allows for the whole concatenated arrangement of extensive harmony and cooperation that can only occur in the absence of dynasties starting and programmed to dominate males. One advantage of this whole arrangement of harmony and cooperation is size. With bee colonies, bigger is better. I've mentioned already the problem faced by honeybees in a colony of under 16,000 in a severe winter, but bigger is going to ultimately mean that all the different jobs in the colony can be attended to in a concentrated way. And of these, just one example. The decision to send out a deployment of bees to a new floral source or to translocate to that source in a swarm can be a life or death decision for a colony. In the bee world, there is an imperative to get there before the rival bee colonies, the ants, and all other comers do. It's a get there first principle. The colony that is thinking clearly and gets numbers on the ground fastest wins in a not terribly abstract evolutionary race. One last word on colony fitness as it relates to size and complexity. This will take us into the tricky sphere of game and systems theory. But let's delve briefly. In large, successful and efficient systems, be it in nature or anywhere else, some underperformance is often found. It might even be a defining feature. In bees, this matter has attracted attention from Schmidt and Hempel, 1987, and Houston, 1988. Whilst out foraging, bees adopt a sub-maximal strategy for acquiring nectar and pollen. They carry loads that are much lighter than they are capable of shifting. There are two reasons for this. One, on account of the game theory principle of making yourself a smaller and less attractive target for predators. And two, because of the high energy costs of carrying heavy loads. With bees, there is a straight negative correlation between active foraging and lifespan, and dying early places a strain on the colony. There is, of course, an immediate short-term provisioning shortfall. But more importantly, the colony has to expend energy on rearing and educating the individual forager. This second notion of attention to cost effectiveness should be summarized as the "you're no good to anyone dead" principle, and has wide applications in systems theory. A simple example would be, if you've got a car that can do 200 miles an hour, you don't run it at 200 miles an hour. It will start vibrating, the rivets will start coming loose, and eventually the whole thing will clag out. This applies to almost any area of activity you can think of: engineering, architecture, athletics, horse racing, and virtually any game. Every system of a certain size attains a greater value than, to use a popular way of putting this, the sum of its parts. The effective use of the system is more worthwhile than anything the individual elements in it could achieve by themselves. So it's more important for every constituent element to work reasonably well than to have a situation where one element wears itself out, with the net result of the entire system failing. Notice two things about these ideas relating to systems of higher complexity. One, they are at variance with Darwinism. It's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the system that actually works. And two, they suggest that the animals living in the sub-social cool zones of planet X, where the goal is, on the whole, to grab as much food as you can, as fast as you can, will always live in a state of grinding dysfunction. Part 4. Does biological analysis help us to understand the dream? Answer, yes. It reveals that the dream is the dream of northern hemisphere males, the dream of males who have their origins in a largely difficult dog-eat-dog subsocial world. In their northern world, those males are likely to dominate for reasons to do with physical strength and not much else. But they have their eyes on a very great prize, the eusocial world of the South, where a single female dominates through fecundity and a highly ordered polity of subordinates. The southern world is an attraction for the northern male for now and evermore, and from every point of view: the sex, the food, the raw materials, the high civilization, and the high learning. From every point of view, that is, except one, and that is paternity assurance. In the subsocial northern world, the male has power over his, notionally, single female, and over his children that are notionally all his own. In the south, conditions are quite different. Living there him would have a lot to offer, full-on luxury in the context of an entire world of slavish subjects do one's bidding. But life with the Queen of the South would pose a problem for him. You don't know where she's been. And you don't ultimately know where her allegiances lie. The Queen of the South and her polyandrous world would see the northern male lose his identity as an aner. What a heavily loaded word that is in Greek. Would lose his identity as a real man. In short, in the literary imagination of the European world of the North, the northern male can be a self-sufficient entity, a hero, a king, but in the world of the fecundity package of the South, he's just another brick in the pyramid. Conclusion. In this talk, we looked at the phenomenon of the Great Southern Queen in ancient art. We focused first on an especially ancient image, one from the Bronze Age, a depiction of the Queen of Punt, in order to see the concept we're interested in a concentrated form and in a particularly unsophisticated context, that of the revealing obviousness of pharaonic propaganda. Then we surveyed the concept of the southernness of the southern queens by way of reminding ourselves exactly who these queens are, and touched on the complication of some of the civilization emblem queens being from the east. We gave as the basis of the phenomenon of the queen as fecundity civilization package the paleontological fact of the Fertile Crescent. In a brief digression, we gave the parallel case of the Phoenix story. Then there was a look at biology. Starting with the Planet X theoretic, we outlined the background to the emergence of a view that sees nourishment as driving evolution. Then picked out the notion of eusociality with a view to explicating the concept of the superorganism, using as an example honeybees. Finally, we stated what the dream is and how it functions in the Greco-Roman psyche. A northern male looks out at the southern world and sees nothing but the life conditions for perfection, as well as the life conditions for genetic ruin. Thanks.